footing leader at one point. I know him as someone who worked very hard with us on the Eastern Shore here at Shore Progress for education reform, protecting our environments, labor rights. If it was a good piece of legislation, we had conversations with Eric about it. Now he has had the important role for a couple of years now, and he'll touch a little bit more on himself, being the senior policy advisor for Governor Wes Moore, making sure that our governor is getting good advice on things like the budget, or what bills to prioritize, and other important things to make our state move forward. So I'm going to go ahead and stop talking because you didn't come here to hear me ramble. Connor, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Can we pin him so everyone can see him, please?
Yeah, and I apologize. I'm going to be off screen for another minute here. I'm walking back to my car from speaking to a student group at the university. So thanks for your patience. Apologize for being late. And thanks to everyone for joining and being active with the caucus. Thanks to you, Jared. You do a fantastic job in helping to organize folks on the lower shore. And, I think honestly, what you guys do is a model that a lot of the rest of the state could be copying and should be copying. So yeah, I serve as senior policy advisor to Governor Moore. I've been with him since day one of the administration. If you ever want to pull me aside sometime and ask stories about the time I got to play Dan Cox in debate prep with the governor, I'm always happy to share those stories. But most of my job now is focused around the budget and dealing with the current budget crisis in the state. And I'll talk a little bit about that, and then I know folks are going to have questions. Jared asked me in particular to talk about, where the conversations are at in Annapolis right now, and also how progressives and Democrats can be talking about the budget that comes out. And I'll share with you kind of my approach to that as I've been talking to folks both, kind of the individual level and on the at the community level when I'm doing press or speaking to an organization of some kind. Get my camera working here so y'all can see me. Hi. So the governor describes what we're experiencing right now as two storms. The first of those storms is that Maryland has not been growing the way that it needs to. Under Governor Hogan, there were two things happening simultaneously. One is that the state budget kept growing. In fact, the general fund budget under Governor Hogan grew by 70% in the 8 years that he was governor. The other is that our economy was not growing. And of course, the economy not only is important because it's jobs for people and it's opportunity, but it's important from the state government perspective because it means tax revenue that we can then use to fund the government. So, it is a brutal fact of math that when you are spending more and more money and you don't have more and more money coming in, eventually you're going to be short. So that's storm number one that we've known was coming for a while. The structural deficit we have this year was predicted as far back as 2017. Governor Hogan did really nothing to address it. He papered over it using pandemic era dollars that came down from the federal government and then kicked the can down the road until the end of his time in office. So the second storm is the Trump administration. And the reality is, however folks feel about Donald Trump's politics generally in Maryland, we are uniquely reliant on the federal government. We have a huge part of our economy and a large percentage of our workforce that either works directly for the federal government or works as a government contractor or works in industries that in some way are supported by the federal government. The current chaos and the Trump-Musk cuts that we're seeing, people getting laid off, is already impacting the state of Maryland. In fact, earlier today, the Bureau of Revenue Estimates, which is the entity that estimates how Maryland's economy is doing and what tax revenues are going to be for the next year, wrote down state tax revenues by $350 million, based just on what we've seen so far in terms of job losses from contractors and federal employees, in terms of impacts to things like capital gains taxes from what's been happening to the stock markets as a result of Trump's, tariff tennis game, his back and forth. And we expect those challenges to continue and to grow. And they're affecting, every part of our economy. You're hearing from a lot of farmers that they're having trouble getting grants that they were promised by the federal government for things like installing solar panels on their greenhouses. You're seeing the potential of significant staffing cuts at the Departments of Veterans Affairs. So the VA hospital out on the shore could see people laid off and a harder time, veterans having a harder time getting the services that they want. You could see cuts at places like Wallops Island. 60% of the employees at Wallops Island live on the lower shore of Maryland. They live in Maryland. And that is already having and will have even more direct impacts on Marylanders. So our challenge this session is to figure out how to work through those two storms. And the governor's proposal has been to address it by taking a balanced approach. Out of the $3 billion budget deficit, Governor Moore took the difficult step of proposing about $2 billion in cuts. That's on top of cuts in both of the previous two fiscal years. In fact, all three of Governor Moore's general fund budgets have been lower than the last budget that Larry Hogan introduced, because we've been trying to deal responsibly with the structural deficit and not just kick the can down the road. The remaining $1 billion of the deficit this year, we've proposed a set of revenue proposals, some of them taxes, some of them other types of revenues that are focused on providing the basic funding we need to continue providing the services that Marylanders rely on. Those, are still very much up to debate. We're into now nearly the last 30 days of the legislative session. Those of you that have watched Annapolis for a while know that 90% of the work gets done in those last 30 days. So we still have a lot of the work ahead of us. We are still working through exactly what the legislature's response is going to be on the budget proposals. They will make some changes. Some of the cuts that we've made, they don't like, and they will restore. They will propose some additional cuts that will go into the final budget. And similarly, on the revenue package, not everything that we proposed in terms of tax reform is going to make it through either. But, at the end of the day, what the governor's goal is, he's not necessarily wedded to any single proposal. What he's wedded to is the values that he put into his budget. And really the three big things that he's highlighting and that, I've been highlighting with community groups is the governor believes in giving some tax relief, giving a break to the middle class. His proposal does that. His proposal would lead to income tax cuts for 60% of Marylanders. He believes in fixing the state's anemic economic growth by actually implementing a cohesive strategy for economic growth, including significant focus on three core sectors, one of which is aerospace, which is particularly important given Wallops on the shore. And he believes in taking care of our people. And what he said to the legislators is, as long as the final budget and tax reform does those three things, he's comfortable with it. So we are, the too long don't read version of this is we are working through the details, but at the end of the day, the governor's goal is to give a break to the middle class, to grow the economy, and to make sure we're taking care of Marylanders through a difficult time. I will share with you, because Jared also asked me to address the issue of how to talk to folks about revenues and about taxes. So I'll share with you a couple things that are informed by the work of our communications team and our messaging folks, some of the public polling that we've seen. Donald Trump, the cuts he's making in DC right now are really about making enough room in the federal budget for him to make permanent his tax cuts from 2017. Those tax cuts, for the first time in American history, mean that millionaires are paying less in federal taxes than middle-class Marylanders. What we're focused on in Maryland is giving a break to the middle class, not to millionaires. And it doesn't make sense that somebody making $30 million a year is paying the same amount as a family making $250,000 a year. So the governor's tax proposals are intended to make the tax system more fair. For the second year in a row, the governor's really been focused on preventing increases in the taxes that hurt families' bottom lines the most. I think the best thing to call out there is property tax. We are not proposing an increase in the property tax. Um, and the other thing I'd say, and this is borne out by public polling, is that many of the tax proposals that are being put on the table are actually widely popular in the state of Maryland. Marylanders, by a margin of about 70%, do believe that wealthier people should pay more in taxes than the middle class and working class. They do believe that it's that raising revenue by doing things like increasing the tax on cannabis or increasing the taxes that casinos pay on their profits from gambling is worthwhile if it helps prevent cuts to public services. And that's a really key point. What the public, if you're just debating taxes on the surface, if all you're talking about is taxes, then of course people are going to say, I don't like that idea. I don't want to pay more. I don't necessarily think other people should pay more. But that's not what it's about. Taxes don't exist in a vacuum. They are about paying for the public services that we all rely on. So if your kid attends a school or a university, if you drive on state roads or you use transit, if you rely on any kind of government service at all, police and fire protection, it's the taxes that pay for it. And the question is not whether you like or dislike taxes. It's, do you believe that it's okay to ask wealthy Marylanders to pay a little bit more if it means we don't have to cut those core services we all rely on? And that's the argument that is most appealing to the public. Not everybody's going to be convinced. There are some folks that believe the government already taxes too much and should cut. And so you're not going to get everybody with that sort of messaging, but it will appeal to most middle of the road people who understand what it is to balance a family budget, and they understand that you've got to make tough choices. So. Jared, that's kind of my pitch. I know you wanted to do some Q&A. I think you might have had some questions, and I'm happy to take some time to answer whatever anybody wants.
Yes. So how questions going to work? If y'all in person, if you could just raise your hand.
Jared, I'm having trouble hearing you. I'm sorry, man.
I do not know what's happening there, but we can't hear. No, it's not going through here. I just unmuted you. I just unmuted you. So you do that. All right, you can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right, cool, great. We're gonna start with. Hold on, there we go. Nope, do that.
Hey, can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. The joys of being able to hear someone when they're not muted. So anyway, so how questions are going to work tonight. If you're in person, if you can raise your hand, say your name, what county you're from, if you're with an organization. Online, if you want to just raise your hand, put your name, same thing. Again, as always in every short progress meeting, we've never had an issue with this. Please be cordial. If you say anything ridiculous off the wall, Connor's going to mute you. You're not going to get your question out. But yeah, everyone knows what civil is. With that, I have a question to start, and then Connor, if you can make a list of people for me to call. The first one is, one of the big questions is the federal budget. If the federal budget doesn't get passed next week and there's a government shutdown, is there a risk that session gets extended, that we can't pass a budget, or is it independent from? Because I've heard both this week.
Yeah, I mean, we tend not to extend sessions. There is a risk that we would come into a special session later in the year to address further budget issues. I've heard different things from different people about how likely a shutdown is. We are right now planning as if there's going to be a shutdown because we have to plan for the worst. We are hoping there won't be. But even if there isn't a federal shutdown, the Republican budget alone would have massive impacts to the state. I mean, they're just the cuts to Medicaid. They're proposing $800 billion of cuts in Medicaid. That's about $1.5 billion to the state of Maryland alone. and the state can't afford to pick that up. So so if the worst happens, either in terms of a shutdown or in terms of a federal budget, a special session's a real possibility. I would expect us to be able to pass a budget before the end of session, but there's always a possibility.
Thank you. Who's the first question, Connor? I'm not seeing any hands here.
First is going to be Jessica Gallatin. Have you on mute?
Yeah. Yes,
Hi, can you hear me?
we can.
Yep.
Oh, great. I just had a really quick question because I've had a couple of conversations. It's tough to talk to people about taxes. I totally understand that. But I think where people are struggling is to understand exactly where you're saying that the taxes are going, especially if we're trying to like talk about, funding the things that you need. There's been a lot of concerns about the DDA and those very vulnerable folks. So we've heard that there's been corrections to the DDA budget and know that there was a supplemental provided to adequately fund that because they just didn't project their costs correctly. But I was curious to know from you if you could comment or maybe give some ideas on what's the governor's plan to address some of the cost containment actions that are being proposed by DDA, especially after hearing how harmful they were in testimony. If he still kind of feels that way or just doesn't understand what those actions are doing and causing to the most vulnerable folks that we have.
Can you say what county you're from?
Sorry, Cecil?
Thank you.
Gotcha. Thanks for the question, Jessica. It's a great question. Look, the governor believes deeply in the work that DDA does, and he wants to do right by the families that receive services from DDA. And the budget of DDA has more than doubled in 4 years. And, that's not the fault of the families.
No,
it's
right.
frankly the fault of mismanagement in prior years. Essentially what happened, and, I've been involved in the DDA issue for about 4 weeks now. I got put into it by the governor, is that under the prior administration, you had the creation of self-directed services for the first time with very few rules about how it was being run within the department. And you had the essentially rewriting of a lot of the community services side of DDA, and things grew rapidly. And so what we're trying to do is find ways to bend the curve of those increases, but in ways that limit impacts to families. I think the most important thing that's happening right now is that both the administration and the legislature have been spending a tremendous amount of time talking to families, talking to some of the organizations that represent people with IDD themselves, and also the families of folks with IDD, and really asking the question of, how would you address this issue? What are some of the things that you think would be a better way to approach it? Because we understand that the original cost containment proposals were not the answer. And we're getting there. We had the announcement a couple of weeks ago that that both the legislature and the governor's office found funding for to restore the fiscal 25 cuts. We just released our supplemental budget. But again, the state's in a difficult budget situation. So in order to fund the additional DDA funding in the supplemental budget, we had to cut funding for some of the state's climate investments, and we had to cut funding for some of the state employee salaries. And those are the kinds of tough decisions that we're making right now and that the legislature is making right now. What I'll say is that, the disability advocacy community has absolutely been heard. And, I think the administration and the legislature are both working in good faith with advocates to try to find the final answer here.
Thank you. Our next question comes from in person. Before we jump to you, Roxy, I do want to highlight real fast, we have 3 elected officials in the audience. Wacomico County Councilman Josh Hastings, Chair of the Dorchester Democratic Central Committee, Sidney Bradner Jacobs, and Democratic Central Committee member Sarah Gavian. I apologize for not mentioning you earlier. Next, we're going to turn it over to Roxy. Can you say your name, who you're with, and your council?
Roxy Herbekian. I'm with Unite Here, Local 7. So,
Hey, Roxy, how you doing?
I'm doing good. I sent you an email earlier today.
Yeah, I saw it. I appreciate it.
Okay, well, we represent, hospitality workers, hotel,
Mhm.
restaurant, food service and casinos. We're the largest casino workers union in the country. We represent the folks here at Ocean Downs Casino in Berlin, Maryland. And I'm joined by Nancy Stack and Cynthia Carmichael, they're dealers at the casino. And we've looked very closely at the governor's budget with regard to raising more money with casinos. And we've got two things we're sort of looking at and trying to balance. One is certainly our members, our membership generally is dependent on a lot of Maryland services, and we are sensitive to what the budget is going to look like. We
Sure.
also are sensitive to what some of this will have in terms of impact on the jobs of the folks who work in the casinos. So
Sure.
we tried to take kind of a surgical approach to it that both
Mhm.
looks at sort of it's a little bit of a patchwork, the way the taxes are right now. And in addition to that, as part of looking at the workers' jobs, the dealers at this casino are the only dealers in the entire state that are non-union, and somehow we're
Mhm.
not covered by the labor peace agreement. So we're
Hmm.
wondering if there's an opportunity to have some discussion about, like, let's look at how we can get that revenue that is needed by the state from the casinos, but in a way that will not create a lot of harm to jobs. And secondly, getting labor peace for these workers at the casino in Ocean Downs.
Yeah, Roxy, absolutely. Like, happy to set up a time for us to talk, and think through it more. I didn't realize that the labor peace agreements didn't apply out there. That's
Very odd. It did, but they were one of the first casinos. So everyone that was there organized the labor peace agreement. When they added table games years later, they didn't. And these workers are like the lowest paid dealers in the state.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, let's find some time to talk it through. I'll say on the revenue side, when we were putting together our revenue proposal, one of the things that we tried to be very aware of was the impact on the brick and mortar casinos because of the union jobs at those casinos. So, what we proposed, the most significant increase, really the big increase in casino taxes in the state was on mobile sports betting only, not on the in-person gaming. And we did that very intentionally. There's obviously also the debate that's run around in Annapolis on iGaming, which, the governor's position on that has been that he believes that if iGaming ever comes along, that we need to make it right with the workers and make sure that the union's at the table in that conversation. But to date, that proposal does not seem to be moving in Annapolis. But yeah, I'll follow up to your email and let's find a time to talk more.
Thank you.
We have a question online.
Yes, the next question is going to come from Cody Stevens.
Cody, if you can just share what county you're from.
Sure, I'm in Dorchester County.
Thank you,
Hey,
sir.
Cody, how you doing?
Good, Eric. How are you?
Good.
Might be a familiar name. My name's probably been in your email a couple times.
Yeah.
And over the past couple of weeks, I've had an opportunity to be back and forth into Annapolis regarding what Jess was kind of referring to with some of the DDA initiatives that are going on there. Had an opportunity to talk to the governor and lieutenant governor directly, and I've been part of like the working groups regarding the DDA's like self-directed manual issues
Right.
and the budget itself.
Yeah.
And you kind of touched on some of this with what Jess was talking about, but I kind of wanted to kind of detour just a little bit because I know that there have been actions taken regarding having a voice for the actual families involved and how things are going to be moving forward. I know that the administration has done that. I've seen it firsthand. And I wanted to really just give an opportunity because I know that there are some families on that, they told me they were going to come on because they knew you were going to be here. Regarding, just how much our community will have say moving forward regarding things like the manual issues that are there, as well as how we're moving forward with the cost containment and the budget.
Yeah, I think the key is what I've been working through, what we're working through right now is how to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table in these decisions. I think it's understandable the frustration about the manual release last fall, and some of the conversations that happened around cost containment that people felt kind of left out of the conversation. And I think, I didn't do a lot of work on DDA issues before the last 4 weeks, so I'm relatively new to this policy area. But my sense is that you know, the state has done a pretty good job historically in creating formal avenues for the community services side to have input, and has not built that out in the same way for folks who participate in self-directed services. So that's, you know, I think the first step we have to solve right now is we have to figure out the current budget conversation, the cost containment conversation. And then the second step is, how do we make sure that people have a seat at the table going forward in these decisions? And, you know, the challenge is, you know, seat at the table doesn't necessarily mean that folks are always going to get what they want, but they should have an opportunity to be heard. Right? That's the goal. So we're still kind of thinking through that. And if you have ideas, like, we'd love to hear them. But we're committed to that, you know, transparency and to including people in the process.
Thank you. Our next question's from online. Sarah, can you unmute? Because that question was really long and it's going to be hard to read out from across the room.
Okay, but now I have to find it again. Thank you very much. I'm from the Dorchester Democratic Central Committee, and we're working very hard both in Dorchester and across the Eastern Shore to understand the impacts of the federal cuts and some of those on the, you know, on us. And I know it's early days, that there's a lot of fear, and then there's, you know, things go to court and they stop and they start, and you must be wrestling with that as well. And you're obviously not responsible for answering what the feds are doing. But what we're trying to do is confront Andy Harris with this. We're working hard on that. So I'm wondering if you have sources of information that you can share on cuts to the VA, Medicaid, the Chesapeake, you know, the environmental protection of the Chesapeake, from the federal level, agriculture. I'm thinking of all the different things, pending closure.
Yeah.
So that's a big list, and the information comes from different places. But anything you have or can point us to so we can look at the impacts locally would be very useful to us.
Sure. And actually, that's a good point. I'm going to take that back also to the state party and talk to them a little bit about it. You know, we are, like everyone else, dealing with the constant stream of new announcements. Somebody described it to me a couple days ago as carpet bombing, and I think that's pretty apropos. You know, so I don't have a direct source I can point you to today. That's like an easy place to go to find that kind of information. But I will work on it, and if you share your contact info with Jared, he can get it to me, and I'll follow up with you. I think the best thing I can recommend right now is that the state party, and in particular folks at the national level, like the D-TRIP and the DGA, are putting out information pretty regularly through their press release portals about individual cuts. Now, they're not going to be Shore specific, but they'll at least give you a place to start. You know, we know of, as of today, approximately 1,500 state residents who are federal employees who've lost their jobs. There are about 10,000 probationary federal workers in Maryland who live in Maryland who could be affected if the probationary firings are eventually upheld by the courts. We know that 2 Social Security offices have been ordered closed in the state of Maryland. You know, one of my worries is, bluntly, that as the feds are looking at these draconian cost-cutting measures, that what we're going to see is them going for the lowest hanging fruit. In other words, you know, what are the facilities that have the least foot traffic that they can choose to shut down? And by and large, frankly, those are going to be in rural areas. So we're really concerned about the impacts to rural VA health system, to the ag programs of various kinds. We're already hearing from farmers, like I said, that have been struggling because federal grants have been frozen to them. And then, you know, we're worried as well about the many federal employees that live on the shore, right? And the big concentrations of those, I think, are, you know, Wallop's employees on the lower shore. You've got a fair number of folks in the central shore that commute into, you know, the Naval Academy or Fort Meade or some of the installations on the western shore. And you've got a fair amount of folks in Cecil County that commute over to APG or even down into the city. So, you know, those are going to be harder to trace and track down. But I will follow up with Ken Ullman and the state party and talk to them a little bit about how we can do a better job sort of collecting that information and providing it to people.
Um, oh, yeah, next we have Claire. Claire, if you can sing, you know what to do.
Yeah. My name's Claire Boland. I'm from Wacomico County and I'm with Shore Progress. And feel free to tell me that like this isn't within your job's purview. So I have some questions, well, a question about the pausing of the blueprint
Uh-huh.
and what the next steps are regarding
Sure.
regarding that.
Yeah, and you know what the governor's proposed is not pausing the entire blueprint. What we did is we took a close look at the blueprint and the parts of it that we think are experiencing some implementation challenges, because the governor believes deeply in the blueprint and wants to make sure it's successful. And if we start running into significant challenges with implementation that are disruptive, then we think public support for the blueprint could be undermined over the long term. So the two biggest things that we proposed pausing, one was the implementation of collaborative time. That's because to fully implement collaborative time, Maryland will need about 15,000 more teachers than it has today. And so we want to pause it temporarily and use some of that money to reinvest in the teacher training pipeline, to get more people trained up to teach in classrooms. The other piece that we proposed for a shorter pause is the community schools program. That's simply because the community schools program has grown very rapidly and we've seen spotty implementation. So some places are doing a really fantastic job with community schools and some counties aren't really. And we want to make sure that that money that we're putting into community schools is being spent in the way it was intended. That is to support the kids with poverty who are living in those communities. So, where it's at right now, the House moved the bill with many of the policy changes, but they didn't want to pause those two, the implementation of those two programs. Or rather, they paused collaborative time for a year, but did not cut the funding. So the funding would continue to flow to the county schools, even though it wouldn't be required to be used to give teachers more time to do their jobs. And so that bill is going to go over to the Senate. The Senate's going to have probably a different take on it. And, I can't tell you what the final version of it's going to be. But I feel pretty confident there's going to be some adjustments to the blueprint. The thing is, with this blueprint conversation, it's a conversation among a bunch of people who really deeply believe in the blueprint and want it to be successful. And it's just a question of how to get there. And folks, particularly, I've found that one of the flaws in education policymaking in Annapolis is that we don't always do a good enough job listening to the unique challenges that school systems on the shore experience, in terms of things like teacher training and recruitment, in terms of, rural schooling is very different than schooling in many other parts of the state. So, we need feedback. And if the school systems on the shore, if the teachers unions on the shore, if, parents and students on the shore are experiencing the blueprint in a different way than folks on the Western Shore, then we need to hear that so we can, consider those as part of the adjustments.
It looks like we have just two more questions. I really appreciate it. I know you're sitting in your car. I know you'd like to get home to your family at some point.
Happy to do it. I appreciate being invited.
This next person you're going to know very well from your county, back home, David Hondowitz.
Hondo, what's up, David?
You got me out of order now.
I like to keep you on your toes, Connor.
I know.
Hi, Eric. How are you?
Good.
I don't know if you had seen, but right before Winter Mako, Brian Sears wrote a very good article about the state of play with the Transportation Trust Fund.
Mm-hmm.
And the part of the theme of his article at the time that I seem to remember was sort of, we have this issue with the trust fund, which I know you're well aware of. But unlike other of the challenges that you've alluded to in your comments with the budget, it didn't seem like there was much of focus in Annapolis on how to address it this session. Since the session started, I haven't seen in press coverage, and I don't recall hearing in any of the briefings that we get at the county council about where the trust fund is. And I could just add, you'll understand this. I think everybody else will get the point. But there are a lot of state SHA issues in particular that there is absolutely no way we're going to be able to address until the overall trust fund is addressed. And the key example of that I know you're very familiar with is Route 198. We're hearing from mutual constituents of D14 and D5 and Council 5, which is an eastern part of Montgomery County for everybody else, about safety issues that the quarter study clearly will improve, but I'm being told by SHA they just don't have the money to even have it compete for design and construction. And based on my years of experience that I have, that's a plausible explanation. But when I mention that to our constituents, they still end up focusing more on us pressing SHA versus encouraging them to reach out to everybody in Annapolis to deal with the overall trust fund issue.
Sure.
So since, we're still understandably talking about DDA and the blueprint and all of that, I was wondering if you had any insights on where things are with trying to deal with these systemic issues. I know the Senate and the House have diametrically different opinions about how to address it.
Yeah, I mean, for everyone's background, transportation in Maryland is funded through something called the TTF, the Transportation Trust Fund. It's separate from the general fund. It's got separate revenue sources for the most part. And, all transportation, state highway, the state airports, the port, the transit administration, the toll facilities, they all go under the TTF. And there's a challenge, a long-term challenge with the TTF, because historically the way we funded transportation in Maryland was with the gas tax. And people are using less gas. It's not even so much because people are driving electric cars. It's just that cars have better fuel efficiency than they used to, and more people are driving hybrids. So, states, this is not a Maryland specific problem. This is every state in America we're all trying to figure out how to fund our transportation systems long term. We took some actions last year that were a head start on that, including, the implementation of some changes to registration fees and things like that. There is an active conversation going on about transportation funding in Annapolis. The governor proposed about $420 million in additional transportation revenues, primarily through a change in how in a sales tax exemption that car dealerships receive, and a retail delivery fee to compensate for the wear and tear that like Amazon and other big companies are putting on our local roads. I suspect that at the end of session there will be some transportation revenues that pass. I think you'll see a difference between the House and Senate in where they are on how much. But everyone's committed fundamentally to finding ways to fund the TTF. And I think increasingly what you're going to see is a focus on safety related improvements. Because we don't have enough funding in the TTF, we're really working hard to prioritize projects that pose a real threat to the safety of Marylanders. And that includes, on the Western Shore, things like replacement of the light rail fleet in Baltimore. We literally had a light rail car catch on fire with passengers in it last year because the fleet's so old. Some major rural road projects in Western Maryland, particularly US 15 up through northern Frederick County, and then I-81 through Hagerstown, which are serious safety hazards. But also, there's some bridge projects on the shore and other road projects on the shore that need to be addressed, and we need the revenue to do it. So David, it is interesting that most of the press coverage has not really mentioned the transportation debate. It is happening. It's not the sexiest debate, and so the press isn't really covering it much.
Thank you, Eric. We have one more question, and that is online, and that is Roberta. I'm not going to say your last name because I'll mess it up. So, what? Hankin?
That's a guess.
Yes, that's exactly right, Hankin. Okay, yes, Kent County here, formerly worked at National Education Association for many years.
Hey, great.
Yay. So, okay, how do we talk about Social Security in our communities? Many of our communities are, have a great number of retired folks. And, not taxing Social Security sounds great until you realize it's going to totally hasten the demise of the whole system. So what is your communication advice so that we can talk about it realistically in our communities and its impact on Marylanders?
Yeah, I mean, Social Security nearly eliminated senior poverty in the United States when it was implemented. It's one of the greatest success stories of American history. And it not only is it a system that helps support tens of millions of retired folks in the U.S., but the Social Security disability insurance helps millions more who, by dint of a disability, are not able to work. It is a fundamental part of our social safety net. And, cuts to Social Security and cuts to the staff that provides Social Security are going to make that harder for people to access. And, the way I look at it is it's a promise. Like the federal government made a promise to Americans that if they worked hard, they would get some support. And for anyone to take away that promise is fundamentally a violation of the basic compact between the government and the people. In terms of the staffing cuts we're hearing about at Social Security and the closure of offices, I think it's most important for people who have interacted with the system to tell their stories, because I think people don't know that, applying for Social Security, getting Social Security isn't easy, right? And the process can be complicated, particularly for SSDI. And not having that staff will mean that people just aren't able to get qualified. They're not able to get the benefits that they've earned. And, I think, frankly, look, I think what the Trump administration is doing is abysmal, absolutely abysmal. But where they're overstepping in ways that seriously harm these basic programs that people have come to rely on is, frankly, the administration's biggest weakness. I mean, who thinks it's a good idea to cut Social Security? Who thinks it's a good idea to cut staff at the Veterans Administration? Who thinks it's a good idea to cut grants to farmers that have kept American agriculture, going since the Dust Bowl? So I don't know if that's helpful. I don't do federal work, so I haven't dealt as much with Social Security messaging, but.
Thank you, Eric. Can we give everyone, Eric stayed late tonight to take questions in this call. Can we give Eric a round of applause? Thank you for your continued service for your to our state. Also, thank your wife for her service on the council, and let her know that her friends on the Eastern Shore say hello. And we look forward to seeing you both this summer at NACO.
Hopefully before then, man. And sometime you got to invite me to the caucus, and I'll drive down and do it when it's not in the middle of session.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for doing this